It was in the quiet of her final years, in a small house in Florida, that Hedy Lamarr sat away from the eyes of the world. Once she had been hailed as the most beautiful woman alive, her face illuminating vast cinema halls and her name whispered across continents. Yet the years drew her into seclusion, where the only companions were silence, memory, and the faint hum of distant traffic. To some, she was no more than a forgotten relic of Hollywood's golden age. To others, she was a woman of hidden genius, whose ideas helped build the very future we live in. Few knew how these two stories belonged to the same life, and fewer still knew how much shadow was cast upon her radiance. It is here, in the stillness of her ending, that we begin the long journey backward, to trace her footsteps through beauty and scandal, invention and solitude. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me, where are you hearing my voice tonight? Share your place and time in the comments, for we are weaving a tapestry of memory across the world. And do not forget to press the subscribe button, so this story may continue its journey. Together we walk into the life of Hedy Lamarr, the woman of 1,000 faces and yet of only one heart, restless and misunderstood. In her final seasons, the walls of her modest retreat held more shadows than voices. The blinds often remained closed, shutting out the Florida sun, as if the brightness of the world outside were too harsh a reminder of the lights that once adored her. She spent long hours on the telephone, speaking with strangers, with admirers, with whoever might answer, her voice sometimes trembling, sometimes sharp. These calls were her tether to a world that had long moved on, a thin wire that kept her from vanishing entirely. And yet, even as her body aged and her reflection became unfamiliar to her own eyes, her mind clung to fragments of the past. She would speak of inventions, of ideas unrecognized, of opportunities squandered, and of the stage from which she had been pushed too soon. Like a candle left in an empty room, she burned quietly, the light smaller but still defiant against the darkness that sought to swallow her. Is it not curious how brilliance and despair can live so near each other, like neighbors sharing a thin wall? In Hedy's life, they were entwined inseparably. The world saw her as beauty, yet she wished to be seen as mind. The world wanted her on screens, yet she wished to live on blueprints. The dissonance grew louder as time went on, and in the end it left her stranded between two truths, belonging fully to neither. We who now look back may wonder, did she live as two separate women, or was she always one, misunderstood by all who gazed upon her? In her solitude, the sound of the past lingered like echoes caught in the air. Imagine the flicker of an old film reel playing against a cracked wall. The images are blurred, the colors faded, yet in them, a beauty almost too bright to be real appears again. Her laughter once filled theaters. Her gaze drew men into silence. Her presence was said to shimmer like water under moonlight. But just as swiftly, the film strip burns, leaving the acrid smell of smoke. For beneath the glamour lay unease, a life marked not only by admiration, but by scandal, exploitation, and betrayal. When the reels stopped, she was left with herself alone, and that was perhaps the most difficult role of all. So let us follow her, step by step, not rushing, but wandering carefully, as if down a dim corridor lit by candles. At each turn we will pause, listen, and reflect. For her story is not merely a tale of beauty or invention, but of how a woman can be both celebrated and forgotten, adored and misunderstood, honored and abandoned. Perhaps in hearing it slowly, we may glimpse something of our own lives mirrored faintly within hers. For is it not true that each of us holds secrets that the world will never know? Faces that will never be seen, dreams that may never be believed? In those last years, she would sometimes press her fingers to her temple, as if recalling the equations she once sketched, the drawings she once laid before men in uniforms who barely glanced at them. She knew she had given something to the world, frequency hopping, a method that would one day allow satellites and wireless signals to travel unseen and secure. Yet the world had not thanked her in her prime. Only later, too late for her to feel it deeply, did recognition arrive. Awards and honors came when her hands were too tired to hold them, when her eyes were too dim to read the letters of praise. How bitter must it have been to be known only after the need for knowing had passed. And yet her story cannot be told only in bitterness. For within her solitude there remained sparks of defiance. Even in her withdrawal, she resisted the silence of obscurity. She lived, and that was her final rebellion. Some say she lived too fiercely, burning through 6 marriages, through countless affairs, through fortunes earned and lost. Others say she lived too quietly, hiding her genius in shadows, allowing others to take the stage she deserved. Perhaps the truth lies between, or perhaps there is no truth at all, only fragments. She was not a saint nor a sinner, but something more complex, something more human. Picture the final evenings. Outside, the Florida night was heavy with the scent of salt carried from the sea. Crickets sang in the dark, the world indifferent to the memories of a forgotten star. Inside, the glow of a single lamp fell across her face, no longer the flawless visage of youth, but still holding the outline of that once great beauty. Did she recall the streets of Vienna, the laughter of directors, the sound of applause rolling like thunder across cinema halls? Or did she turn away from such thoughts, refusing to let the ghosts of the past disturb her quiet? It is here, in this silence filled with unasked questions, that we pause. For this silence is not only hers, it belongs to us as well. Each of us will one day face the fading of light, the slipping away of recognition, the whispers of memories that others may never know. What then remains? For Hedy Lamarr, what remained was a body weary, a mind still restless, and a legacy waiting to be uncovered. And so the real flickers, the image wavers, the sound of applause fades. What we hold now is not her glory, but the memory of it, fragile and fading. From this quiet, we step backward in time to see not the woman at her end, but the child she once was, walking the cobblestones of Vienna, before the world had yet discovered her, before the weight of beauty and invention had pressed upon her shoulders. The light fades on the small house in Florida, leaving only the whisper of the sea outside and the distant hum of electricity through the wires. The light fades on the small house in Florida, leaving only the whisper of the sea outside and the distant hum of electricity through the wires. From that hum, we return to an earlier sound, the echo of small footsteps along a cobbled street, a faint drizzle falling upon old stones, and the muffled voices of Vienna at the dawn of the 20th century. Here we find the beginning of the story. Far from the brightness of Hollywood, far from the bitterness of exile, Hedwig Kiesler, the girl who would become Hedy Lamarr, walked in a city steeped in music and ideas, a city where the air itself seemed charged with intellect, culture, and secrets. Vienna was a place of great beauty, but also of lurking shadows, its grand facades hiding disputes of politics, of art, of identity. For a child, it was a place of endless curiosity, where every corner whispered with the possibility of discovery. Her father, Emil, was a man of gentle influence upon her life, and she often spoke of him with affection. He would walk with her through the city, pointing out the mechanisms of machines, the intricacies of gears and pulleys, the quiet miracles of technology that others passed by without notice. From him, she learned to see beyond the surface, to seek the hidden workings of the world. He did not instruct her as a teacher to a pupil, but as a companion to a companion. And in those conversations, seeds were planted that would bloom later in ways no one at the time could have imagined. It was in these walks that her mind began to shape itself, not merely dazzled by beauty, but restless, probing, always asking why and how. Her mother, Trudy, was of a different influence, musical, refined, devoted to social graces. She encouraged in her daughter the performance of elegance, the careful cultivation of poise. Hedy would learn to move like one who is always on a stage, every gesture precise, every glance deliberate. Between father and mother, she absorbed two contrasting worlds, the inner mechanics of reason and the outer performance of allure. Together, these worlds form the foundation of a life destined to be divided between the mind and the face, between invention and image. Vienna in those years carried a strange fragrance. Coffee houses buzzed with intellectual debates, artists challenged the boundaries of form, and composers carried the old traditions into new, dissonant futures. Yet beneath the charm was a restlessness, a tension that would soon tear Europe apart. To a child, it may have seemed like ordinary life, but in hindsight, the air was heavy with change. Perhaps this too shaped her. The knowledge that brilliance is never far from chaos, that beauty can dissolve into disorder in a moment. Hedwig grew, and her beauty was noticed early. Neighbors, relatives, strangers remarked upon her face, her eyes, her carriage. Praise flowed freely, but with praise came expectation, the subtle pressure of being seen not only as a child, but as a figure to be admired. What does it do to a young soul to be admired more for appearance than for thought? Does it not plant a seed of restlessness, a hunger to be known for more? Even as she learned music and language, even as she began to dream of performance, the whisper followed her. Beauty, beauty, beauty. A blessing, yet already a shadow. The theaters of Vienna called to her imagination. To sit in a darkened hall, to watch the stage illuminate with characters larger than life, was to step into another world. She dreamed of belonging to that world, not as a spectator, but as one who shaped the dream. At first, the dream was innocent, a child's longing for wonder. Later, it would become a path of escape, a way to move beyond the narrow streets, beyond the gaze of family and neighbors, into the vastness of a stage where she could be anything, anyone. But even here, the seed of contradiction was present. To seek freedom through the most public form of exposure, to seek identity through the masks of others. Her education was conventional, but her mind was not. She absorbed lessons quickly, impatient with the ordinary. Stories suggest she was curious to the point of mischief, always asking more than was offered, always imagining possibilities beyond what was given. The rhythms of the classroom could not contain her. She wanted not only to know, but to create. Already she drew, she tinkered, she speculated on designs, though these were dismissed as the amusements of a bright but distracted child. Yet what others dismissed remained alive in her, waiting for the day when her sketches would attempt to change the course of war. Still, childhood was also filled with ordinary joys, the laughter of games, the warmth of gatherings, the sweetness of pastries shared in cafes. There was nothing in those moments to suggest the scandal, the exile, the fame, or the solitude that would follow. Only a girl with bright eyes, a quick step, and a restless spirit. And yet, is it not in the ordinary that destiny often begins? The unnoticed afternoons, the quiet lessons, the casual remarks that plant themselves like seeds, later rising as towering destinies. The world around her was not free from shadows. Vienna in the early 20th century was a city of contradictions, a place where sophistication thrived alongside prejudice, where intellectual openness lived beside narrow intolerance. Hedwig's family was Jewish, and though they lived in relative comfort, there was always the underlying presence of otherness, the sense of being both within and apart. Did she feel it strongly as a child? Perhaps not at first, but such things are felt even if unspoken. This too would become part of her journey, to belong and not belong, to be celebrated and yet othered, to move between acceptance and exclusion. Her early fascination with performance grew, and soon she sought to study the art of acting more seriously. The theater school opened its doors and she stepped within, carrying the dual gifts of beauty and ambition. Teachers noticed her immediately. How could they not? Yet admiration can be both encouragement and burden. She advanced quickly, finding roles, catching attention, but the attention was always shadowed by her face, her allure. It was as if the world had decided in advance what she was, leaving little space for what she might become. Did she sense already the trap that lay ahead? Or was she still intoxicated by the applause, unaware that applause, once gained, can never be escaped? There were evenings when she walked home from rehearsals, the city lights glowing softly in the mist, and she must have felt the thrill of possibility. The stage was open, the roles many, the future unwritten. The world was wide and inviting, and she was young enough to believe it could be hers. In those steps echoed the hope of one who believed she could command her destiny. How fragile such hope seems when viewed from the vantage of time, how quickly it can be caught, redirected, twisted. And yet we should not rob her of those early joys. For in the cobblestone streets, the lamplit cafes, the hushed voices of an audience leaning forward in anticipation, she felt the first intoxication of being seen, of being heard, of shaping imagination itself. This intoxication would drive her forward, into roles greater and more perilous, into scandals and escapes, into the brilliance and the ruin of fame. The footsteps of Vienna echo still, carrying us forward. The young girl grows into a young woman, and the stage expands into cinema, the flickering light of film casting its spell. The applause she first tasted in small halls will soon swell into the roar of controversy across Europe, for her first true role would be unlike any the world had yet seen. From the echo of footsteps, we approach the sound of a theater door locked against protesters, and behind that door, the images of a film that would mark her forever. From the echo of footsteps, we approach the sound of a theater door locked against protesters, and behind that door, the images of a film that would mark her forever. The year was 1933, and Europe stood in the trembling space between two wars, the air heavy with uncertainty and change. In the midst of this fragile moment came a film unlike any that had been seen before, a film that dared to cross boundaries of propriety and to expose what had long been kept hidden. Its name was Ecstasy, and in it, the young Hedwig Kiesler appeared not as a child of Vienna, not as a student of the stage, but as a woman whose face and body would ignite endless controversy. She was barely 20, yet already she was stepping into a role that would define her image for the rest of her life. Ecstasy was not an ordinary film. Its story was simple, but its treatment was daring. It showed love not as a whispered suggestion, but as a physical reality. Hedwig, who would soon abandon her birth name for the glamour of Hedy Lamarr, was filmed running through fields, her body revealed in ways no actress of her generation had ever permitted. Nudity, so common in art, so long hidden in cinema, now appeared upon the screen, embodied not by an anonymous figure, but by a living young woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through the lens into the soul of the viewer. The scandal was immediate. In some countries, the film was banned. In others, heavily censored. Critics denounced it as indecent. Moral leaders condemned it as corrupting. Yet in darkened halls, audiences sat in astonishment, unable to turn their eyes away. For Hedy, the experience was more complicated than mere scandal. She was still forming her identity, still seeking her place in the world of art and performance. To her, the film may have been a step of ambition, a way to push her career into the wider world of cinema. She could not have known how inescapable its shadow would become. The world is not gentle to those who first break its rules. It takes what it desires and then punishes the giver for having given it. From this film onward, Hedy would always be marked. No matter what roles she played, no matter what inventions she offered, ecstasy would cling to her, whispered behind her name, shaping the way she was seen. Even in Hollywood, years later, when her glamour was celebrated, this film haunted her, as if the world could not forgive her for showing what it secretly longed to see. The filming itself was difficult. She was young, inexperienced, pressured by director and circumstance. There were stories of her unease, of her reluctance, of her being convinced to do scenes she did not fully understand. Was she exploited, or was she a willing pioneer? Perhaps it was both. She was not the first nor the last actress to be caught between ambition and compromise, between desire for recognition and the cost of achieving it. The camera captured her vulnerability, and the world transformed that vulnerability into spectacle. What is the cost of being seen so fully, so early? Can one ever reclaim the parts of oneself that have been offered to the gaze of the world? In Vienna, the whispers grew louder. Her family felt the sting of scandal. Her mother recoiled from the shame, her father perhaps more quietly saddened. The city that had nurtured her now looked upon her with suspicion, fascination, and judgment. To be admired and condemned in the same breath is a heavy burden, and Hedy bore it before she was fully grown. It is said that she once remarked bitterly that she would never escape ecstasy, that no matter what else she achieved, the world would always remember her for this one role. How many of us are remembered not for the sum of our lives, but for a single moment, a single choice, taken perhaps in youth, without full knowledge of what it would mean? Yet amidst scandal, the film brought her recognition. Producers and directors knew her name. The path to greater stages, to wider fame, was suddenly open. But fame born of scandal is a treacherous foundation. It can lift one quickly, but it can also collapse without warning. The paradox of Hedy's life was here already present. The very act that gave her entry into the world of cinema also shackled her to an image she could never entirely shed. She was both liberated and imprisoned by the same moment. Perhaps she knew it, perhaps not. But already the pattern was forming. Beauty as gift and curse, ambition as triumph and downfall. The film itself lingers in history, not only for its content, but for its symbol. It stands at the edge of old cinema and new, at the moment when art began to wrestle with truth more openly, when film sought to show not only the face but the body, not only suggestion but experience. Hedy was the vessel for this transformation, and in being so, she carried the weight of it. The applause that followed was mixed with condemnation, and the shadow of scandal stretched long across the years. In later interviews, she spoke rarely of the film. When she did, her words were sharp, sometimes dismissive, sometimes defensive. One senses that she wished to erase it from her story, or at least to bury it beneath her other achievements. Yet time has no mercy. The reels of ecstasy survive, the images remain, and audiences even now return to them with curiosity. For some, it is an artifact of cinema's daring. For others, it is an example of exploitation. For Hedy, it was both her beginning and her burden. How can one reconcile such contradiction? Perhaps it is not possible. Perhaps the truth of her life lies in the fact that contradictions were never reconciled, but carried always together. The theater doors closed against protesters, but the film had already escaped. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Once known, it could not be forgotten. The world had marked Hedy Lamarr, and she would carry that mark across oceans, across marriages, across decades. Beauty had given her entry, but scandal had written her name in letters that would never fade. Was it destiny, or was it chance? Could she have chosen otherwise, or was she always to be drawn into the role of both goddess and exile? The locked theater grows quiet. The film reel stops turning. The screen goes dark. Outside, the sound of clinking glasses rises, for in this same moment she was about to enter another chapter, one even more confining, one gilded with wealth and yet bound with invisible chains. A marriage that seemed at first to promise security would soon become a prison. From the locked theater door, we pass to the echo of crystal glasses, raised in a hall of luxury, and with them, the faint rattle of chains hidden beneath silk and velvet. Outside, the sound of clinking glasses rises, for in this same moment she was about to enter another chapter, one even more confining, one gilded with wealth and yet bound with invisible chains. The scandal of ecstasy had traveled swiftly, and among those who heard of the young actress was a man of immense fortune and influence, Friedrich Mandl. He was an arms dealer, wealthy beyond measure, a figure moving in the darker currents of politics and war. To some, he was charming. To others, ruthless. To Hedy, still young, perhaps still wounded from the whispers that followed her, he appeared as a man who could offer stability, protection, and an escape from the uneasy gaze of a judgmental society. When he pursued her, she yielded, and soon she became his wife. But what seemed a union of promise would quickly reveal itself as a cage of gold. The wedding itself was lavish, the kind of affair that filled columns in the newspapers, adorned with silks, flowers, and music. Guests from powerful circles attended, men who spoke not of art or theater, but of politics, arms, and power. Hedy entered this world like a jewel displayed in a case, admired but not free. At first there was fascination, the thrill of wealth, the novelty of grand dinners and endless luxuries. She was no longer the scandalous actress, but the wife of a man who commanded respect in the highest corridors. To her family, perhaps, it seemed a restoration of dignity, a way of erasing the shame of her film. But to Hedy herself, the gilded halls soon revealed their shadowed corners. Mandl was not a man who loved lightly. His affection was possessive, his admiration consuming. To him, Hedy was not a partner, but a possession, a prize to be displayed and guarded. He forbade her from continuing her career, locking away her aspirations behind the walls of his estate. She was surrounded by wealth, gowns of the finest cloth, jewels that sparkled like captured stars, banquets that overflowed with delicacies, yet each indulgence was another thread in the net of control. Guests would admire her beauty, but she could not speak freely. She was silenced, her opinions ignored, her movements observed. Beauty had again become a prison, this time gilded with luxury. At these dinners, Hedy observed much. Men of power gathered at her husband's table, their words heavy with the politics of an era sliding toward war. She heard names whispered: Mussolini, Hitler, men whom Mandl courted for business, for influence, for profit. Arms were discussed as casually as art once had been in her father's walks. Deals were struck over wine, weapons designed over cigars. Hedy sat silent, listening, absorbing. Though treated as decoration, her mind was awake, noting the details, the strategies, the mechanics of power. She was excluded from the conversation, yet she learned by listening, her curiosity sharper than her husband could have imagined. In these stolen observations, seeds of future invention were planted, seeds nourished by the very captivity meant to diminish her. But the cage grew tighter. Mandl's jealousy was notorious. He could not bear the thought of others admiring his wife, even in the form of her past work. Stories tell of how he attempted to purchase every copy of Ecstasy, to erase from the world the images that had first drawn attention to her. The irony was bitter. He loved her beauty, yet despised the fact that others might also have seen it. He adored her, yet he silenced her. He gave her everything material, yet stripped away her freedom. How heavy it must have felt to sit in rooms filled with opulence and to feel the weight of chains invisible but unbreakable. What is luxury when it robs one of breath? What is security when it suffocates the soul? These questions may not have been articulated in her youth, but they must have haunted her nights. The walls of the estate pressed in, the endless attention of her husband suffocated, the absence of her own work gnawed at her spirit. She had escaped one scandal only to enter another captivity. The irony of her life was unfolding already. Every escape seemed to lead to a new confinement. Every triumph carried within it a hidden loss. And yet captivity sharpened her resolve. In the silence of those years, she must have dreamed of escape, planned in whispers within her own mind. She had learned that beauty could open doors, but also close them. She had learned that men who sought to possess her also underestimated her. She had learned that patience was sometimes the most powerful weapon. While Mandel flaunted his power, she quietly nurtured her will to be free. One can imagine her in a grand dining room, seated beside him, listening to the discussions of weaponry and warfare, her face composed, her eyes serene, while within her mind a quiet rebellion was already forming. Vienna itself was changing during these years. The city of her childhood was darkening under the shadow of fascism, its beauty strained by the rising tide of hate and division. For a Jewish woman, even one hidden within luxury, the air grew dangerous. Perhaps Mandel's power protected her for a time, but she must have known that protection could never last. Her very survival might depend on escape, and escape would mean leaving not only her husband, but her homeland, her language, her past. It would mean becoming a wanderer, a refugee, a woman without anchor. To plan such a leap required courage and desperation in equal measure. Did she fear? Surely. Did she hesitate? Perhaps. Yet at some point the balance shifted. Luxury was no longer enough to outweigh captivity. Safety was no longer enough to silence longing. And so, in secret, she began to plan. The details of her flight vary in retellings. Some say she disguised herself as a maid, slipping past guards unnoticed, others that she drugged her husband and fled under cover of night. But the essence remains. She chose to risk everything for freedom. It was not only a physical escape, but a symbolic one, the first of many reinventions that would define her life. From the clinking of Mandel's crystal glasses, from the suffocation of silks and jewels, she walked into exile, carrying nothing but her determination and her restless mind. But before the door closed behind her, she had lived those years in the cage of luxury, and they shaped her. They gave her knowledge of power and its corruption, of wealth and its emptiness, of control and its cruelty. They taught her the value of freedom, not as an abstract idea, but as the very breath of life. These lessons would not leave her. They would travel with her across oceans, into the studios of Hollywood, into the blueprints of invention. Her captivity had been real, but so too was the strength she found in surviving it. The crystal glasses fall silent. The guests depart. The great estate grows dark. A carriage waits in secrecy, or perhaps a train, or perhaps only her own feet upon the stones of Vienna. However it happened, she escaped, and in the darkness of night, she left behind husband, homeland, and name. Ahead lay the uncertain light of freedom. The clink of crystal dissolves now into the steady rhythm of train wheels, carrying her away, each turn of the wheel a heartbeat, each mile a shedding of chains. The rails stretch into the unknown, toward exile, toward reinvention, toward the next chapter of her restless life. The clink of crystal dissolves now into the steady rhythm of train wheels carrying her away, each turn of the wheel a heartbeat, each mile a shedding of chains. The sound of iron against iron filled the night as Hedy fled from the gilded prison of her husband's world. Whether it was by disguise, by cunning, or by sheer luck, the truth of her escape has always remained partly hidden, wrapped in layers of story and myth. Some say she dressed as a maid, slipping past guards who never thought to look closely at the servant girl. Others tell that she drugged her captors with wine, leaving them slumped at the table while she fled into the dark. Perhaps both are true, or perhaps neither. What is certain is that she left with courage, and that she did not look back. Freedom often begins in silence, in footsteps taken against fear, and in this silence her journey into exile began. The night beyond Vienna was vast. As the train rattled through fields and forests, she must have felt the weight of both terror and exhilaration. Each station passed was a risk. Each official encountered a danger. Yet the further she traveled, the more certain her heart became. No longer was she the wife of Mandel, ornament to his empire of arms. No longer was she a prisoner within walls of luxury. She was once again Hedy, young, ambitious, restless, with a mind too alive to be caged. And yet she was also a fugitive. She carried with her no protection, no wealth of her own, only the fragile hope that she could begin again in a world already shadowed by war. Beyond Austria, the landscape widened into exile. She moved through Europe, crossing borders like stepping across fragile ice. The continent itself was trembling, the old order breaking, the rising tide of fascism growing stronger with each passing year. Refugees streamed across borders, their eyes hollow, their voices weary. Among them now was Hedy, though she was unlike many others, for her beauty gave her passage where others might have been refused. Beauty was both shield and snare. It opened doors, it drew assistance, it gave her opportunities. Yet it also exposed her to danger, to unwanted attention, to the hunger of men who saw her face and not her soul. Still, she pressed forward, moving from city to city, until at last she reached the shores of freedom, or what seemed to be freedom, in England. It was in London that she began to reinvent herself once more. There, chance brought her into the orbit of Louis B. Mayer, the powerful head of MGM Studios, who was seeking new stars to bring to America. Mayer had heard of her scandal, of the film Ecstasy, of the beauty whispered about across Europe. He was cautious, but also intrigued. In their meeting, he saw both risk and possibility. Hedy, ever perceptive, sensed her chance. She bargained, she charmed, she showed that she was not merely a silent ornament, but a woman capable of shaping her own destiny. Mayer agreed to take her across the Atlantic, to Hollywood, where her face would soon be lit upon screens brighter than she had ever known. In that moment, the fugitive became a voyager, stepping onto a ship that would carry her across the ocean into the heart of American myth. But before the crossing, let us pause with her in those in-between days, for exile is not only a change of place, but a change of being. What must it have felt like to stand in London's mist, the air damp with coal and fog, hearing English voices all around her, knowing she was alone, unknown, untethered? The streets of Vienna were behind her forever. Her family remained there, in peril. Her old name, Hedwig Kiesler, was slipping away. Ahead lay a new name, a new self, yet unformed. Such moments of transition are fragile, filled with both fear and promise, a life shed like an old garment, another waiting to be donned. Did she tremble, or did she walk with confidence? Perhaps both. Exile is a strange companion. It makes one both vulnerable and strong, broken and resilient. And in Hedy, these opposites lived side by side. The ship set sail. Across the Atlantic she traveled, leaving behind the uncertainty of Europe for the dreamscape of America. The sea stretched endless in all directions, its waves crashing with rhythms both soothing and ominous. Nights on deck must have been filled with reflection, the stars scattered above like fragments of forgotten dreams. She was young, yet already she carried within her the weight of scandal, captivity, and flight. She had seen wealth, she had seen confinement, she had tasted the bitterness of being both admired and silenced. Now, as the ship carved through dark waters, she must have wondered what awaited her. Would she truly begin anew, or would the ghosts of her past follow her across the ocean? The sea gave no answer. It simply carried her onward, as it has carried countless exiles before, into a future unknown. Upon arrival, America dazzled and unsettled her. New York was vast, noisy, alive with a pulse unlike any she had known. The tall buildings seemed to scrape the very sky. The streets roared with voices, horns, the ceaseless energy of a nation moving toward its destiny. Yet it was Hollywood that called her, the promised land of reinvention, where names and faces were reshaped into legends. MGM would give her not only a new career, but a new identity. No longer Hedwig Kiesler, she was renamed Hedy Lamarr, a name designed to shimmer with mystery and allure. It was as if her past had been erased in a stroke of a pen. The fugitive became a goddess. The exile became a star. Yet the past cannot be so easily erased. Beneath the glamour, the memory of chains, of trains, of whispers in Vienna lingered. The new name glittered, but it also covered scars unseen. How strange that freedom often requires the shedding of self. She had fled captivity, but to secure her place in America, she had to surrender her old name, her old story. She had to play the part the studio demanded. Hollywood was no less a cage than Mandel's estate. Though its bars were made of light instead of iron, its guards were contracts instead of soldiers. Yet within her, the restless mind endured. Even as she posed for cameras, even as she spoke lines written for her, she dreamed of invention, of discovery, of freedom that could not be taken. Exile had taught her that nothing external could guarantee liberty. Only within herself could she hold the key. And so the wheels of the train that carried her from Mandel's world had not stopped. They continued, transformed now into the hum of engines, the sway of a ship, the roar of automobiles in America. Each sound carried her further from her past, and yet each sound also reminded her of the fragility of freedom. For freedom, once gained, must always be guarded, and Hedy's life would show how easily it could be stolen again. The train's rhythm fades now into the glow of a ship's lantern, swaying in the dark waters of the Atlantic, guiding her toward the next transformation, the next captivity, the next escape. The glow of a ship's lantern swaying in the dark waters of the Atlantic fades now into the blinding shimmer of California sunlight. The ship had carried her safely, and with it came her rebirth. Hedy Lamarr, no longer Hedwig Kiesler, stepped onto American soil as if stepping onto a new stage, the air alive with promises and illusions. New York had been overwhelming, its towers scraping the sky, its streets loud with relentless ambition. But it was Hollywood that beckoned, that strange oasis in the desert where dreams were manufactured with the precision of a factory and the glitter of a fairy tale. There she would be remade. There she would be named anew. Louis B. Mayer, the man who had brought her across the ocean, knew well how to sculpt myths. He studied her with the cold calculation of one who dealt not in human lives, but in faces, voices, shadows upon screens. He told her that the world would forget the scandal of ecstasy, that the whisper of Vienna could be buried beneath a new name. He offered her the shimmering syllables of Lamarr, chosen to echo the name of an earlier silent star, Barbara Lamarr, whose beauty had dazzled audiences but whose life had burned out swiftly. It was a name that shimmered like polished glass, smooth, radiant yet fragile. Hedwig Kiesler was gone. Hedy Lamarr was born. The studio system in those years was a kingdom unto itself, and Mayer was one of its monarchs. MGM groomed her as they groomed all their stars, molding her into a vision of what the audience longed to see. Her hair was styled, her costumes chosen, her voice trained to soften her accent, her gestures refined into poise. Every part of her was shaped to fit the myth they wished to sell. The girl who had fled Vienna, who had hidden behind disguises, who had crossed borders in fear, was now presented as a goddess of the screen, untouchable, flawless. Yet behind the perfection, the restless mind still stirred, restless as ever. Hollywood was a city of masks. In its studios, sets rose like cardboard dreams, palaces built in a day, landscapes painted upon canvas, lives rehearsed and retaken until they shimmered with false perfection. Hedy stepped into this dream willingly but not without unease. She had escaped one captivity only to enter another, though this time the chains were softer, woven of contracts and applause. She would be given fame, wealth, and admiration, but she would also be denied the fullness of herself. Again, she would be seen but not heard, admired but not understood. Her first films in Hollywood presented her as mystery, as allure, as exotic enchantment. Audiences marveled at her beauty, critics praised her presence, and soon the phrase, "the most beautiful woman in the world," was attached to her like a crown she could never remove. It was both a triumph and a burden, for beauty so praised becomes a prison of its own. Every line she spoke was measured against her face, every gesture reduced to ornament. She had fled one husband's cage only to step into another built of celluloid and expectation. And yet, within the confines of this Hollywood myth, she found moments of triumph. She stood beside great actors. She lent her presence to stories that captivated millions. In darkened theaters across America, audiences sat entranced, their eyes fixed upon her luminous face, their hearts stirred by her gaze. She became not merely an actress, but an icon, a figure larger than life. For those hours in the cinema, she was loved beyond measure. But when the reel stopped, she was again alone, the applause distant, the adoration intangible. Fame is a love that does not embrace, a devotion that does not comfort. In her quiet hours, she turned again to invention. Hollywood might demand her beauty, but her mind refused to be silent. In her dressing room, in the corners of her home, she sketched ideas, toyed with designs, imagined possibilities. Radios, mechanisms, improvements for everyday life. Her restless intelligence reached in directions no one around her could see. She spoke of ideas to colleagues, to directors, to friends, but they smiled indulgently, as if beauty and brilliance could not inhabit the same body. She was a goddess, they said, but not a thinker. They admired her face, not her mind. In this dissonance lay her deepest frustration. Still, she played the part given to her. She walked the red carpets, she attended the parties, she smiled for the cameras. Beneath the glitter, however, she carried memory, the streets of Vienna, the cold eyes of Mandel, the hushed voices of arms dealers over their wine. She carried exile, loss, and longing. The studio could change her name, but it could not erase her past. And perhaps it was this, the depth behind her beauty, that made her presence on screen so powerful. Audiences could not name it, but they felt it. Behind her gaze lay secrets. Behind her smile lay sorrow. Behind her beauty lay something untouchable. In Hollywood, beauty was celebrated but also consumed. Stars were commodities, their images packaged and sold. Hedy knew this, and she lived it. Contracts bound her, roles limited her, publicity shaped her. She was elevated and diminished at once. Yet in the midst of it all, she sought moments of her own choosing. She cultivated friendships. She pursued affairs. She lived as fiercely as she could within the constraints imposed upon her. Her life was a pendulum swinging between control and rebellion, between confinement and escape. What must it have felt like to walk upon a set built to resemble a palace, to wear gowns fit for queens, to hear one's name whispered with awe, and yet to feel a hollow echo within. What must it have been to know that one's mind held possibilities for invention, for discovery, for shaping the future, while the world only asked for another smile, another pose, another film? Such contradictions can break a soul, or they can deepen it. In Hedy, they did both. The whir of cameras became her new background, the hush of a darkened cinema, her new stage. Yet always beneath the glamour, the silence of exile remained. She was free and not free, admired and imprisoned, goddess and fugitive, all at once. And so her story in Hollywood began, not as a tale of pure triumph, but as another chapter of paradox, where light and shadow could never be separated. The whir of the cameras grows louder now, rolling film through their reels, catching her face in light. Yet even as the reels turn, the sound of applause hovers in the air, swelling, cresting, and then fading too quickly, leaving behind only silence. It is into this silence that we step next, into the world that crowned her, the most beautiful woman in the world, a crown as heavy as it was dazzling. The whir of the cameras grows louder now, rolling film through their reels, catching her face in light. Yet even as the reels turn, the sound of applause hovers in the air, swelling, cresting, and then fading too quickly, leaving behind only silence. And in that silence, a title took root, one that would cling to her for decades to come, the most beautiful woman in the world. The phrase sounded like praise, like an offering, like a crown placed upon her brow. But to Hedy, it was both blessing and curse, a gift that dazzled and a chain that bound. It was not she who named herself so, but rather the machine of Hollywood, eager to shape her into a legend. Publicists, journalists, directors, all repeated the phrase until it seemed a truth carved in stone. Magazines carried her face. Her gaze looked down from posters. Her name floated on the lips of admirers who had never met her. The phrase gave her fame, but it also stripped her of everything else. She was not an actress, not an inventor, not a thinker, not even a woman with doubts and desires. She was the most beautiful, a title so large it erased the person beneath it. On the screen, her beauty became myth. She played queens, temptresses, exotic strangers whose allure bent the wills of men. In films like Algiers, her presence eclipsed the story itself. Audiences remembered her face long after the plot had faded. Directors framed her in shadow and light, each angle sculpting her into perfection. Audiences gasped, critics wrote in awe. Yet Hedy herself, behind the veil of roles, felt the emptiness of such acclaim. She knew that she was being admired not for her craft, not for her intelligence, but for an image carefully constructed and endlessly repeated. What is it to be loved only for a mask? Does not the soul long to be seen beyond the surface? At premieres, crowds gathered, their voices rising like waves, their hands reaching for a glimpse of her gown, her smile, her autograph. The flash of cameras blinded, the roar of attention filled the air. She smiled, she waved, she played the part with practiced grace. But when the lights dimmed, when the red carpets were rolled away, when she sat alone in her dressing room, the silence returned. Applause does not linger. It evaporates into memory, leaving the performer with the echo of what was and the hunger for what may never be enough. Hedy tasted this paradox daily, adored by millions yet isolated in her own longing to be truly known. She was aware of the irony. Once she had been trapped by Mandel's jealousy, confined within his house, his demands, his possessive love. Now she was confined again, not by a man, but by an idea, by the relentless insistence that her worth lay in her appearance. The studio demanded she maintain the image, perfect skin, flawless hair, an aura of unattainable beauty. Any crack in the illusion was dangerous. Age itself was an enemy. She was not allowed to be ordinary, not allowed to be human. The myth must be sustained, even if it consumed her from within. Yet beauty was not her only burden. It was also her weapon. She used it to secure roles, to bargain in conversations, to protect herself in the shifting world of Hollywood. She knew the power of her face, and she wielded it when she could. But power used in such ways also leaves scars. For each door beauty opened, it also closed another, the door to being seen as more than beauty. Men admired her, desired her, pursued her, but few listened to her ideas. Few could imagine that behind the luminous face was a mind capable of invention, of engineering, of shaping technologies that would outlast the very films in which she starred. Her colleagues admired her professionalism, her presence on set, her ability to embody roles with subtlety. Yet even here, she was often dismissed as decoration, as the woman whose beauty was the point, not her craft. How many times must she have asked herself what more she could offer, if only the world would look beyond the surface? How many sketches of inventions lay discarded, ignored, while contracts demanded another role in another film where her gaze mattered more than her words? The paradox of beauty is that it both reveals and conceals. Hedy's beauty revealed her to the world, made her unforgettable, placed her name among the great stars. Yet it concealed her essence, distracted others from her mind, her struggles, her desires. She lived as both revealed and hidden, luminous and unseen. Such duality wears upon the soul. Perhaps it was this weight that pushed her into restlessness, into marriages that faltered, into affairs that burned quickly, into nights of searching for something that applause could never provide. Yet let us not paint her as only tragic. There was joy, too, in her reign as Hollywood's queen of beauty. There must have been moments when the applause lifted her, when the admiration warmed her heart, when she looked into a mirror and saw not the prison of beauty, but the wonder of it. To deny her those moments would be to strip her of her humanity, for even in paradox, there are flashes of grace. She lived the dream that millions envied, and though it was heavy, it was also real. She was loved, she was admired, she was remembered. How many lives pass without such intensity? Still, the silence after applause is long. Hedy carried that silence into her evenings, into her reflections. Beauty fades. But the title, the most beautiful woman in the world, lingered, etched into her identity. Even when she longed to shed it, it clung to her. She was not allowed to grow old without the comparison to her youth. She was not allowed to exist without the myth overshadowing her. And so the crown, once dazzling, became thorns. The more tightly the world clung to her beauty, the more deeply she longed to be seen beyond it. And in that longing, her restless mind found another path. While the world adored her face, she turned inward to her inventions, her sketches, her quiet work. If beauty trapped her in roles not of her choosing, invention promised freedom, a chance to be valued for thought rather than form. She could not silence the world's gaze, but she could silence her own hunger by feeding her curiosity. And thus, while applause faded, another sound grew louder in her life. The tapping of typewriter keys, the scratching of pencils, the pulse of ideas demanding to be born. The applause fades now, leaving a hush, as if a theater has emptied, and only the echo of footsteps remains. From this hush comes the faint tap of keys, the rustle of papers, the quiet hum of invention. It is into this hum we walk next, where Hedy's mind, overlooked and underestimated, began to sketch the blueprints of the future. The applause fades now, leaving a hush, as if a theater has emptied and only the echo of footsteps remains. From this hush comes the faint tap of keys, the rustle of papers, the quiet hum of invention. It is here. In the spaces between films, in the hours when Hollywood demanded glamour but gave her solitude, that Hedy's restless mind began to emerge most vividly. For while the world adored her as an image of beauty, she sought meaning through creation, through discovery, through the silent labor of thought. In her dressing room, among powders and mirrors, sketches lay scattered. Not lines of dialogue, not studio notes, but diagrams of mechanisms, ideas for improvements, devices that might alter the way people lived. She had never lost the habit of her father's early lessons, those childhood walks in Vienna when he had explained the workings of gears and engines. The memory of machines fascinated her, and even now, beneath the surface of Hollywood's artifice, she returned to that fascination. She tinkered with designs for traffic signals, for pillboxes, for modifications to aircraft. She was a star on screen, but in private, she was something else, a mind hungry to solve, to shape, to invent. In those years, the world beyond Hollywood grew darker. The drums of war beat again across Europe. Hitler's shadow spread over Austria, over Germany, over lands that Hedy once knew as home. Refugees crossed seas, armies gathered, the air thick with foreboding. Though she lived in California, far from the battlefields, the memory of Mandel's dinner tables lingered. The hushed conversations of arms dealers, the sketches of weapons, the whispers of men who spoke of conquest as casually as others spoke of theater. She had been silent then, but she had listened well. Now, as war drew nearer, those memories stirred again, and her mind, restless and determined, sought ways to fight back. It was in this restless state that she met George Antheil, an eccentric composer whose own life was marked by unorthodox experiments. He was known for his bold music, his willingness to shock audiences with dissonance and innovation. To many, he was a curiosity. To Hedy, he was a kindred spirit, one unafraid to imagine beyond the ordinary. They found each other not in the studios, but in conversations that drifted far from film and music into the realm of invention. Together, they began to sketch an idea that seemed improbable, even fantastical at the time. A system to prevent the interception of military communications, a method by which signals could leap from frequency to frequency, impossible to track, impossible to jam. The inspiration came from unlikely places. Antheil had experimented with synchronized player pianos, rolls of paper moving in precise coordination to produce music. Hedy saw in this a model for secure communication. If two pianos could play in perfect synchrony, why not two radios? If signals could leap between channels in a predetermined pattern, enemies could not follow. It was an audacious idea, and together they refined it, merging music with mathematics, beauty with mechanics. The result was what we now call frequency-hopping spread spectrum, a technology that in time would form the foundation of wireless communication, of satellites, of the very devices we carry in our pockets today. But in those days, the invention was a curiosity, overlooked, underestimated. Hedy and Antheil presented their work to officials, offering their design as a tool for the Allied war effort. Yet they were dismissed. The Navy, cautious and unimaginative, doubted that such a system could be practical. More than that, they could not imagine that such a proposal could come from a Hollywood actress and a composer. They saw her face, not her mind. They saw his reputation, not his invention. And so the blueprints were filed away, forgotten, while the war raged on without them. Hedy had given the world a gift it was not yet ready to receive. How bitter must it have been to pour one's mind into creation, to offer it freely, and to be dismissed for reasons of prejudice and appearance. How bitter to know that men who praised her beauty could not believe in her brilliance. And yet, she did not abandon her curiosity. Invention remained her quiet refuge, the secret life she carried even as the world demanded her glamour. For though the studio could script her roles, they could not script her thoughts. In thought, she remained free. What does it mean, then, to live as both muse and inventor? To be celebrated for surface while ignored for depth? Perhaps it means to live always in paradox, always between, never wholly seen. Perhaps it means to carry both pride and sorrow in equal measure. Hedy lived this paradox, her beauty opening doors even as it closed others, her inventions unrecognized even as her image was immortalized. She gave the world two gifts, illusion and innovation, and the world chose to honor only the illusion. Yet time, unlike men, is patient. What was dismissed in her lifetime would later become essential. The blueprints filed away in obscurity would one day be recognized as the foundation of technologies that connect the globe. The brilliance ignored in the 1940s would be celebrated decades later, but in those Hollywood years, all she could do was wait and keep dreaming and keep sketching. The applause of cinema roared and faded. The quiet hum of invention continued, unseen. The tap of typewriter keys grows louder now, steady, insistent, like Morse code, unanswered. It is into that static, that silence of dismissal, that we move next, into the years when her gift for invention remained hidden, unrecognized, as the world plunged deeper into war and chose to forget the brilliance of a woman it saw only as beauty. The tap of typewriter keys grows louder now, steady, insistent, like Morse code unanswered. It is into that static, that silence of dismissal, that we move next, into the years when her gift for invention remained hidden, unrecognized, as the world plunged deeper into war and chose to forget the brilliance of a woman it saw only as beauty. The blueprints she and George Antheil had offered to the Navy were quietly filed away, their potential lost in a bureaucracy that could not imagine the future. Frequency hopping, that audacious weaving of sound and science, lay dormant, dismissed as impractical. And so, as tanks rolled across Europe and cities burned beneath bombers, her mind's offering was set aside. What she had given was a weapon for secure communication, but what the world asked of her was not her mind. It was her face. Hollywood in those years of war turned itself into a stage of propaganda. Films carried patriotic themes, actors lent their voices to rallies, studios aligned themselves with the national cause. Hedy, too, was enlisted, though not in the way she longed. Instead of her invention being tested on submarines, she was asked to sell war bonds, to appear at events where her beauty could be exchanged for money, her smile for signatures. Crowds lined to see her, to touch her hand, to offer dollars in exchange for the illusion of closeness. She raised millions, her presence alone enough to loosen wallets and stiffen resolve. It was not the contribution she wished to make, yet it was the one the world allowed her. How strange it must have felt to stand before a sea of faces, her own face lit by spotlights, and to know that she had already offered something far greater than beauty, and it had been ignored. How cruel to see men cheer her image while dismissing her invention. Did she feel anger or resignation? Did she tell herself that any contribution, however small, mattered? Or did she carry within her a bitterness too deep to name? Perhaps all were true, for the human heart is rarely simple. The war stretched on, and with it, her career. Films continued, though they often gave her roles that emphasized allure rather than depth. She was cast as the exotic, the mysterious, the unattainable. To audiences, she was the dream of beauty that comforted in dark times. But dreams fade quickly in daylight, and Hedy knew too well how shallow such admiration could be. Between takes, between scripts, she returned again to her sketches, her ideas, her restless desire to create something lasting. The applause of cinema was fleeting. The promise of invention was enduring, even if unseen. When the war ended, the world celebrated victory. But Hedy's contribution went unnoticed. Other inventors were praised, other innovations honored. She was forgotten in this realm, as if the blueprints she had drafted with Anthiel had never existed. Yet those blueprints remained, silent witnesses to her vision. They would one day return, though she would not live to see their full glory. In the meantime, she continued to play the roles assigned to her, both on-screen and off. Hollywood demanded glamour, society demanded beauty, and she gave both, though her heart longed for recognition of another kind. There is a peculiar cruelty in offering the world a gift it does not recognize. To give something precious and to see it set aside is to live with a wound that does not heal. Yet perhaps such wounds also deepen the spirit, sharpening resolve, shaping identity in ways that triumph never could. Hedy lived with this wound, and it colored her life in ways subtle and profound. She was both proud of what she had done and pained by its neglect. She carried within her the knowledge that she was more than the world allowed her to be, and that knowledge was both solace and torment. In the years that followed, as her fame slowly began to wane, the silence surrounding her invention grew heavier. Younger faces replaced hers on the screen. Newer stars drew the applause that once had been hers. She watched as the myth of her beauty began to fade, even as the true brilliance of her mind remained buried. To be forgotten in one realm and ignored in another is a double exile, and it was into this double exile that she drifted. Still, she did not surrender entirely. She lived, she loved, she married and divorced. She sought to find meaning in the fragments life allowed her, but always beneath it all was the quiet sorrow of being unseen. And yet history is not without irony, for though her invention was dismissed in her lifetime, it was not lost. Decades later, the principles of frequency hopping would form the foundation of technologies that bind the modern world together. Satellites, secure communications, wireless networks, even the devices through which we listen now, all trace their lineage back to the sketches of a Hollywood actress and a maverick composer. What was dismissed as impractical became indispensable. The future had accepted what the present had refused. But Hedy did not live her life in the future. She lived it in the present, and in the present she was unseen. And so her story through the war years is not one of triumph, but of paradox. A woman who gave the world a gift beyond measure, and yet was valued only for her beauty. A woman who carried within her both brilliance and bitterness, generosity and sorrow. A woman whose life reminds us that recognition often comes too late, that genius is often buried beneath misunderstanding. The static hum of forgotten signals fills the air now, waves leaping and falling, unheard, unheeded. It is in this hum that we step next, into the storms of her personal life, into the loves and marriages that flared and failed, into the search for permanence in a world that offered her only impermanence. For even as her inventions were ignored, her heart sought a different kind of invention, the creation of love that might endure. The static hum of forgotten signals fills the air now, waves leaping and falling, unheard, unheeded. It is in this hum that we step next, into the storms of her personal life, into the loves and marriages that flared and failed, into the search for permanence in a world that offered her only impermanence. For though the world saw her as untouchable, a goddess of the screen, Hedy Lamarr's heart was restless, searching always for a harbor where it might finally come to rest. Yet each time she thought she had found one, the waters grew turbulent, and the harbor dissolved into storm. Her first marriage to Friedrich Mandel had already taught her the danger of chains disguised as love. That gilded captivity left scars invisible but enduring. After escaping, she might have vowed never to be bound again, yet the human heart is seldom consistent with vows. We seek companionship even when it has wounded us. We reach for love even when it has betrayed us. Hedy was no different. She entered marriage again and again, each time perhaps hoping that this one would be different, that this man would see her not only as beauty but as soul, not only as goddess but as woman. Yet 6 times she walked down that path, and 6 times the path ended in separation. To the public, it was scandal. To her, it was perhaps only the inevitable outcome of a heart too restless, too demanding of truth, too unwilling to settle for a cage, however gilded. Her marriages spanned a wide spectrum: actors, producers, screenwriters, businessmen. Each man was drawn first by her beauty, as if compelled by a magnet they could not resist. Each man, in time, recoiled from the very same, unable to reconcile the myth of her with the reality. For to marry the most beautiful woman in the world is not to marry a person, but a legend. And legends are heavy burdens in the quiet of daily life. What man could sustain the weight of such expectations? What woman could survive the disappointment of being loved first for an image, and only second, if at all, for herself? In the early years, there was passion, laughter, the thrill of new beginnings. She gave herself with intensity, as if pouring into love the same restless energy she poured into invention. She wanted more than admiration. She wanted intimacy, connection, truth. But often, she found only disappointment. The men she chose sometimes admired her, sometimes tried to control her, sometimes drifted away into indifference. Arguments rose like storms, accusations cracked like thunder, and soon the bonds broke. Divorce followed, again and again, until the cycle itself became part of her story, another chapter in the myth of Hedy Lamarr. Children came, too, from these unions, though even here her restlessness shaped the course. She loved them, yet her life was not the life of stability, of rootedness. Hollywood demanded her presence. Invention demanded her solitude. Her own spirit demanded freedom. To be a mother while being also goddess and exile was no easy task. The tension between roles tore at her, and her relationships with her children bore the marks of absence, of strain, of complexity. She was loved by them, but also misunderstood, as she was by the world. Perhaps she longed to give them more than she could. Perhaps she hoped they would see beyond her beauty to the soul that even her husbands had failed to hold. Why did love fail her so often? Was it her restlessness? Her unwillingness to be confined, her hunger for a depth few could match? Or was it the blindness of those who saw only her face and not her mind, who could not endure the complexity of a woman who was both goddess and inventor? Perhaps both. Perhaps love itself is always fragile, and in her case, more fragile still beneath the blinding light of fame. For fame magnifies every flaw, amplifies every quarrel, turns private wounds into public spectacle. Love struggles to survive under such relentless gaze, and yet she never ceased to seek it. Marriage after marriage, affair after affair, she returned to love as one returns to a flame, knowing it may burn, yet unable to resist its warmth. Each time she must have believed, if only for a while, that this time might be different, that this man might understand her, that at last she might rest. Each time she was disappointed, but to have sought love so many times is not weakness. It is courage of another kind. It is the courage to hope again, even when hope has failed before. Few of us dare to risk such vulnerability more than once. She dared it 6 times, and perhaps even more in the spaces between. Hollywood watched her loves with fascination, as if they were another kind of film in which she starred. Magazines carried the news of her marriages, her divorces, her romances. To the world, she was scandal, gossip, entertainment. Few cared for the inner truth, the ache of her longing, the bitterness of her disappointment. Beauty attracts attention, but it rarely attracts compassion. Hedy lived under the weight of attention, but seldom received the compassion that might have soothed her. The world consumed her personal life as spectacle, while she herself was left with the fragments. And so her personal story during these years became a storm, one marriage collapsing into another, one attempt at permanence dissolving into impermanence. Through it all, she remained luminous on screen, as if the goddess of cinema bore no resemblance to the woman who wept in private. Perhaps that, too, was her strength, the ability to carry her sorrow unseen, to continue to shine even while breaking. Perhaps it was also her curse. The world never saw her brokenness, never understood her humanity, and so never offered the kindness she deserved. Is it not so with many who are placed upon pedestals? They are worshipped from afar, but not embraced up close. They are admired as ideals, but not comforted as people. Hedy bore this fate more heavily than most. She was adored, but not known. She was pursued, but not understood. She was crowned the most beautiful, but she longed to be loved as most human. The door of her many marriages never fully closed. Always it remained ajar, as if hope itself refused to let her rest. One door half open leads into another, and so the cycle continued. At times she walked through with eagerness, at times with resignation, but always with the quiet hope that this passage might lead to permanence. It never did. The doors remained half open, half closed, leading only into further corridors of restlessness. And now, as one of those doors swings shut, its hinge creaking, we hear not the echo of passion or quarrel, but the faint sound of paper, of contracts shuffled, of scripts tossed into a wastebasket. For as her marriages faltered, so too did her place in the studios begin to shift, and she found herself confronting another storm. The shadow of Hollywood itself, the relentless machine that had once crowned her, now beginning to tire of her. The sound of a door half open fades into the rustle of discarded scripts, and with it, the story turns toward the shadows of the studio. The sound of a door half open fades into the rustle of discarded scripts, and with it, the story turns toward the shadows of the studio. For just as her marriages faltered one by one, so too did her bond with the Hollywood machine begin to strain. MGM had once sculpted her into a goddess, polishing every detail of her image, placing her face in theaters across the world. But the kingdom of Hollywood was merciless, and its devotion fickle. Younger stars were always waiting in the wings, fresher faces ready to replace the icons of yesterday. Hedy, though still radiant, began to feel the weight of this inevitable cycle. The very system that had crowned her was now beginning to whisper that her time had passed. The studio system of those years was not merely employment, it was ownership. Actors were bound by contracts that dictated not only their roles, but their lives. Mayer, the man who had renamed her, controlled the films she appeared in, the interviews she gave, the image she was allowed to project. Scripts were chosen for her, not by her. She longed for roles of depth, of complexity, of humanity. Yet too often she was given roles of beauty, of exotic mystery, of silent allure. She wanted to act, to create, to shape characters of substance. They wanted only to frame her face in light and let the audience marvel. Hedy resisted, but resistance within the studio system was dangerous. To defy MGM was to risk banishment, to fall into obscurity. Still, she pressed against the limits. She walked away from projects she despised. She spoke with defiance. She demanded more. Sometimes she won. More often she lost. In the end, the struggle wore her down. The goddess could not choose her own script. The myth was stronger than the woman. There is a quiet sorrow in knowing one's own potential and watching it dismissed. Hedy, who invented in solitude, who sketched ideas that would shape the future, was told on screen to remain silent, to let her eyes speak, to let her beauty suffice. In the studio's eyes, depth was unnecessary. Glamour was enough. But glamour fades, and when it did, there was little left to hold on to. She saw this truth with growing clarity as the years passed, as the roles grew fewer, as the gaze of the world shifted elsewhere. To be beautiful is to be worshipped, but to be worshipped is to be consumed. Hedy lived in this paradox, and it drained her spirit. And yet, she was not passive. She challenged MGM in ways few women dared. She sought freedom from their contracts, tried to assert her own vision of her career. When she succeeded, she chose roles that revealed glimpses of her artistry, her intelligence, her subtlety. But the industry was not ready to allow her full range. They had written her into a box, and the box was lined with mirrors that reflected only one image: the most beautiful woman in the world. Even when she attempted to step beyond, audiences and critics returned her to that image. She was not permitted to be more. The rustle of discarded scripts became a familiar sound. Roles denied, roles refused, roles abandoned. Behind each was a silent cry for recognition, for the chance to be seen beyond the myth. But Hollywood has little patience for such cries. It moves relentlessly forward, discarding what no longer serves. And so, the shadow of the studio grew heavier, pressing upon her, dimming her star even as she still glowed. Perhaps this was why she turned more fervently to her inventions, to her private explorations of technology and design. Invention asked nothing of her face. It demanded only thought, patience, imagination. In her sketches and designs, she was free of the studio's gaze, free of Mayer's control, free of the crown of beauty that weighed upon her. It was a freedom rare and precious, though unseen by the world. In Invention, she could be wholly herself, even if no one else acknowledged it. The wastebasket in the corner of the studio office fills with crumpled pages, scripts tossed aside, opportunities lost. That wastebasket grows heavy, not only with paper, but with the weight of unfulfilled potential. From it rises the faint smell of burned edges, of dreams denied, of roles never played. And in that smell, we move forward toward a match struck quickly, a flame that flares for a moment and then dies, a symbol of the flicker of her genius, of the brilliance that glowed and yet was extinguished too soon by the weight of beauty and dismissal. The wastebasket in the corner of the studio office fills with crumpled pages, scripts tossed aside, opportunities lost. From it rises the faint smell of burned edges, of dreams denied, of roles never played, and in that smell we move forward, toward a match struck quickly, a flame that flares for a moment and then dies, a symbol of the flicker of her genius, of the brilliance that glowed and yet was extinguished too soon by the weight of beauty and dismissal. For Hedy Lamarr, the tension between the inner flame of invention and the outer mask of glamour never ceased. She lived always at the boundary between what the world demanded of her and what her restless mind demanded of herself. In Hollywood, she continued to shine, yet she knew her stardom rested on fragile foundations. Each new role seemed to echo the last, variations on a theme of mystery, allure, perfection. Audiences admired her, critics praised her presence, but rarely her craft. Even when she attempted to deepen a character, to give her roles shadows and substance, the studio framed her in light, smoothing away the rough edges, ensuring that her beauty remained the story. The flame within her grew impatient. To be confined to surfaces when one knows the depth of one's own spirit is a torment few can endure without bitterness. At home, she returned again and again to her notebooks, her sketches, her tools. She worked on ideas that seemed eccentric to others, but logical to her. She sketched designs for a tablet that could dissolve in water to create a carbonated drink, for improvements to traffic systems, for better aeronautics. Some of these ideas faltered, some failed, but the very act of creating sustained her. It was not success she craved so much as the freedom to think, to imagine, to express herself in ways the camera would never permit. The match flared in these moments, a quiet reminder that she was more than her face, more than her myth. And yet, each flame she struck was quickly extinguished by the world's indifference. Inventions ignored, patents untested, ideas dismissed. Even her greatest contribution, the frequency-hopping system, lay buried in naval archives, forgotten. How does one live with such knowledge? That one has glimpsed the future but is denied its recognition. Hedy bore this knowledge with pride and sorrow, a secret flame she carried within. At times she tried to speak of it, but few listened. An actress, they thought, could not be an inventor. Beauty and brilliance could not coexist in their imaginations. The world's blindness was perhaps her greatest enemy, greater even than the studio, greater even than fading fame. In those years, she was seen everywhere, on screens, in magazines, at premieres, yet she remained unseen in the way she most longed for. Admirers gazed at her photographs, wrote letters of devotion, spoke of her face in rapture. Few asked what she thought, what she dreamed, what she created. To be visible yet invisible is one of the deepest paradoxes of existence. She was luminous and unseen, worshipped and ignored, a goddess with no altar upon which her true self might be honored. The burden of beauty weighed more heavily as time passed. Each year brought younger faces, new stars with fresh allure. The crown of the most beautiful woman in the world became heavier, for it was a crown that demanded she never change, never age, never falter. But time is merciless, and the face that had once captivated millions began to reflect the passage of years. She felt it in the glances of directors, in the hesitation of studios, in the whispers of critics. She felt it most deeply in her own mirror, where the goddess stared back at her, but with faint lines beginning to appear. To be human was forbidden. To be divine was demanded. The flame within her flickered against this impossible demand, straining for freedom. Perhaps this is why she grew restless in her personal life, why she sought love again and again, why she turned to invention with such hunger. Beauty offered her no lasting home. It gave her wealth, it gave her fame, but it did not give her recognition, nor love, nor peace. Only in her inventions, her sketches, her private musings did she find a semblance of truth. There, she was not goddess, but thinker. There, she was not mask, but self. Each idea, however small, was a flame she struck against the darkness of indifference. Each flame burned for a moment, illuminating her soul, before the world's dismissal extinguished it once more. Is it not a cruel irony that those who burn with genius so often find their flames smothered by misunderstanding? Hedy lived this irony to its fullest. She was praised for what she did not value most and ignored for what she did. She lived in a world that demanded she shine outward, while her truest light glowed inward, unseen. And yet, she continued. The match struck. The flame flared, even if only for her own eyes. Perhaps this persistence was her greatest act of defiance, the refusal to let the world's blindness extinguish her entirely. The flame dies now, leaving the faint smell of smoke, the soft glow of an extinguished match. In its afterglow, we hear the faint buzz of a marquee light flickering, one bulb at a time going out. For as her inner flame battled for survival, her outer star too began to dim. The studios grew colder, the roles fewer, the applause more distant. From the flicker of genius, we move into the decline of the star, into the twilight of fame, where beauty fades and the goddess of light finds herself slipping into shadow. The flame dies now, leaving the faint smell of smoke, the soft glow of an extinguished match. In its afterglow, we hear the faint buzz of a marquee light flickering, one bulb at a time going out. For as her inner flame battled for survival, her outer star, too, began to dim. The studios grew colder, the roles fewer, the applause more distant. The the goddess of the silver screen, once hailed as the most beautiful woman in the world, began to feel the quiet erosion of time upon her throne. Fame, like beauty, is mercilessly fleeting, and Hollywood is a city that devours its queens as quickly as it crowns them. There had been a time when her face filled every poster, her name lit every theater, her presence silenced audiences with awe. But the late 1940s and 1950s brought new faces, younger stars whose radiance the studios were eager to market. The machine of Hollywood is tireless, forever hungry for novelty, and the women it adored one year, it discarded the next. Hedy, though still striking, could not remain forever untouched by this cycle. Offers slowed, the scripts that arrived grew less ambitious, the parts smaller, often shallow, often beneath her talent. The roles of mysterious enchantress that once dazzled audiences now felt repetitive, uninspired. She longed for depth, for challenge, for recognition beyond her beauty, but the industry gave her only echoes of the roles she had already played, and so she began to drift. Some films brought moments of brilliance still, glimpses of her presence that reminded audiences why she had once captivated the world. But these were rare, scattered like fading sparks in a long twilight. More often, she found herself in projects unworthy of her, performances that neither satisfied her nor sustained her reputation. The critics, once quick with praise, grew harsher, their words carrying the bite of indifference. The very same who had once exalted her now turned away, their gaze fixed upon younger stars rising behind her. Fame had always been an echo chamber, and now the echo was fading. Hedy, however, was not merely a passive victim of fading fame. She resisted. She sought to control her own destiny, to choose her roles, to shape her career on her terms. At times, she even produced films herself, hoping to break free from the studio system that had stifled her. But independence came at a cost. The safety of the system was gone, and with it, the machine that had once protected her. The risks she took often led not to triumph, but to financial loss, to further decline. Hollywood was not a place where women were permitted to control their destinies easily. When she tried, the system pushed back, and she bore the consequences. Still, beneath the disappointment, there remained pride. She did not bow gracefully to fading fame. She fought against it, even when the fight seemed unwinnable. But in private, the struggle weighed heavily. The applause had been intoxicating, and its absence left a void. Nights once filled with premieres and parties grew quiet. Invitations dwindled, friends drifted away. The silence of obscurity crept in, soft but relentless. To those who live by the gaze of the world, the absence of that gaze can feel like a kind of death. And yet, Hedy did not stop living. She continued to marry, to seek love, to raise her children, to invent in solitude. Her life beyond the screen remained turbulent, filled with passion and restlessness. But the world that had once celebrated her no longer cared for the details of her humanity. She was no longer goddess, only mortal, and mortals rarely command headlines unless they stumble. In the years to come, headlines would indeed return to her, but not for her art, nor for her inventions, but for scandal and sorrow. For the goddess who fades is not allowed to fade quietly. She is dragged back into the light by her falls. The marquee lights flickered one by one until only a few remained glowing. Her name still carried recognition, but less awe, more nostalgia. Audiences remembered her beauty, not her craft, and the industry treated her as a relic of another age. She was alive, present, still filled with restless energy, yet already spoken of as past. What cruelty there is in being both alive and already remembered as if gone. What loneliness in hearing one's name spoken only as legend, while the person still breathes, still longs, still struggles. This loneliness crept into her soul, filling the silence where applause had once echoed. She knew she had given much to the world, and she knew much of it had been overlooked. She had been beauty. She had been brilliance. She had been both goddess and thinker. Yet the world had honored only the mask. As the marquee lights dimmed, she was forced to face this truth more directly than ever before. And in facing it, her life took darker turns, into scandal, into accusations, into acts that bewildered those who had once adored her. The goddess, stripped of her crown, was now left to wander in shadows. The last bulb of the marquee flickers now, a faint glow trembling before it dies. And in the darkness that follows, another sound rises, the sharp crack of a gavel echoing in a courtroom, the murmurs of scandal spilling into newspapers. From the dimming of her stardom, we move into the trials of her later years, when the world that once adored her returned only to judge her. The last bulb of the marquee flickers now, a faint glow trembling before it dies. And in the darkness that follows, another sound rises, the sharp crack of a gavel echoing in a courtroom, the murmurs of scandal spilling into newspapers. For in the twilight of her fame, Hedy Lamarr found herself not celebrated but judged, not admired but scrutinized. The goddess who had once been adored by millions now stood beneath the harsher light of suspicion, her name tied not to films or inventions, but to accusations of theft. It was the 1960s when the first of these humiliations arrived. The charge was shoplifting, cosmetics and small items from a department store. To the public, it seemed absurd. How could one who had once commanded fortunes, who had been adorned in jewels, reduce to stealing trinkets? Was it desperation, carelessness, or perhaps a cry against invisibility? No one could say. The headlines were merciless, the cameras unkind. Once they had captured her radiance, now they captured her in mugshots, her expression weary, her dignity stripped. For an actress who had lived by the gaze of the world, this reversal must have been bitter beyond measure. She was acquitted in time, the charges dismissed, but the stain remained. For the public, scandal clings longer than innocence. The newspapers rarely print apologies with the same force as accusations. And so, the image of Hedy Lamarr, shoplifter, lived on, whispered alongside the image of Hedy Lamarr, goddess. To be immortalized for both beauty and disgrace is to live within contradictions sharper than most can bear. But this was not the only scandal. Years later, in the 1990s, when she was already an old woman, another charge of shoplifting arose, this time in Florida. Again, the story repeated itself, as if the past had returned to haunt her. Again, the public asked why. Was it need, habit, defiance? Or was it the loneliness of a woman long forgotten, who sought any way, however misguided, to remind the world of her existence? One cannot know. The truth is veiled, perhaps even from her. Human actions are rarely so simple as the headlines that proclaim them. For Hedy, the courtroom must have felt like a cruel parody. Once she had stood on film sets, lights illuminating her face, directors commanding her every gesture. Now she stood before judges, lights glaring harshly, strangers weighing her innocence. In both, she was object rather than subject, judged for what she appeared to be rather than who she truly was. The indignity of it all cut deep. She who had given the world laughter, dreams, even invention, was reduced to a defendant, accused of petty crime. The goddess was dragged into the mud. Yet scandal alone does not explain her decline. Fame had already receded. Wealth had dwindled through poor investments, failed marriages, and lawsuits. Plastic surgery, too, had become part of her story, her attempt to preserve the face that had once been her crown. Each operation sought to hold back time, to keep the mask intact. But the scalpel is a cruel artist, and the results left her face altered, her beauty distorted. Instead of preserving the goddess, it seemed only to emphasize her mortality. The public, unkind as always, mocked rather than sympathized. The very beauty that had been her power now became her vulnerability, her downfall. It is tempting to see these scandals as tragedy, but perhaps they were also acts of rebellion. If the world valued her only as an image, then to shatter that image, even through disgrace, might have been her way of reclaiming agency. To steal, to be caught, to defy expectation. Could this not be a final assertion of humanity? To say, I am not your goddess, I am flawed, broken, ordinary. If so, the scandals were less shame than protest, but protest misunderstood, as her inventions had been misunderstood, as her mind had been overlooked. She was seen, but not truly seen. Again and again, the same fate. In these years, her solitude deepened. She withdrew from the public, avoiding appearances, shunning interviews. The world that had once celebrated her now seemed hostile, filled with ridicule and judgment. She lived more and more behind closed doors, her voice carried only by telephone calls to strangers, her presence reduced to shadows in quiet rooms. The scandals had wounded her, but even more, the silence of neglect had broken her. To be ignored, after a life of such visibility, is perhaps the cruelest fate of all. And yet, within the scandal, within the decline, there remained the stubborn core of Hedy's defiance. She did not vanish entirely. She fought lawsuits against those who used her image without permission. She demanded recognition for her invention, and late in life, it was at last granted. Though too little, too late, she lived to see her name honored for her contribution to technology. It was not enough to erase the bitterness, but it was something, a faint glimmer of justice in the twilight. The gavel's echo fades, its sharp crack dissolving into silence. In its place, we see a mirror, cracked and fogged, reflecting not the goddess of old, but a woman aged, altered, uncertain. The reflection stares back, both familiar and strange. It is here we step next, into the fragments of her self-image, into the years when she fought against time with surgery and sorrow, seeking to preserve what could not be preserved. The cracked mirror waits, holding the faint outline of a face once worshipped, now fractured. The gavel's echo fades, its sharp crack dissolving into silence. In its place, we see a mirror, cracked and fogged, reflecting not the goddess of old, but a woman aged, altered, uncertain. The reflection stares back, both familiar and strange. It is here we step next, into the fragments of her self-image, into the years when she fought against time with surgery and sorrow, seeking to preserve what could not be preserved. For beauty had been both her crown and her cage, and as the years advanced, that crown grew heavier, its weight pressing upon her spirit until she could hardly bear it. Time is merciless with those whom it once adorned most lavishly. For Hedy Lamarr, whose face had been exalted above all others, the passage of years was not merely the natural erosion of youth, but the slow crumbling of an identity forced upon her. To the world she was the most beautiful woman alive. But what happens when such a title collides with age? What happens when the mirror begins to contradict the myth? The goddess, once worshipped, is suddenly revealed to be human. The pedestal crumbles, and the world, instead of compassion, often responds with scorn. Hedy did not submit quietly to this cruelty. She resisted. She turned to surgeons, to scalpels, to promises of restored youth. Each operation was another attempt to hold on to the mask the world demanded she wear. But the knife is no gentle ally. It alters, it distorts, it reshapes. And so, over time, her face changed, not into the goddess of the past, but into something else, something unfamiliar. Critics who had once praised her beauty now mocked her attempts to preserve it. They spoke of her as if she were a curiosity, a cautionary tale, rather than a woman still living, still longing to be loved. The mirror became her enemy. She, who had once dazzled with a single glance, now avoided her own reflection, fearing the confrontation with what had been lost. And yet, behind this struggle was not vanity alone, but something deeper, more tragic. Her beauty had been her prison, but it had also been her survival. Without it, she feared she was nothing. No roles, no recognition, no identity. The world had never allowed her to be valued for her mind, her soul, her essence. It had made her beauty her sole currency. When that currency diminished, she was left impoverished, not merely in wealth, but in worth. Is it vanity, then, to cling to what the world has forced upon you? Or is it survival, desperate and flawed? Her attempts to resist time carried both defiance and sorrow. She defied the fate of being discarded. She sought to fight against invisibility. Yet each surgery, each change, only reminded her more sharply of the inevitability of loss. Time cannot be reversed. The goddess could not be rebuilt. And so she found herself in fragments, her reflection broken, her identity fractured between what she had been, what she had become, and what the world still expected of her. The cruelty of time is not only in the body, but in the gaze of others. Photographs of her in later years became objects of ridicule, circulated not in admiration but in mockery. The very public that had once adored her turned against her with the same intensity. There is something merciless in how societies treat their fading icons. The younger generation, who never felt the original magic, see only decline. The older generation, who remember, measure every wrinkle against memory and lament the loss. In both cases, the human being vanishes. Hedy became not a woman, but a spectacle of age. And yet, even in this cruelty, there was resilience. She withdrew from public life, retreating into seclusion, shielding herself from the gaze that had once sustained her, but now wounded her. She chose invisibility rather than ridicule, silence rather than mockery. The phone became her connection to the outside world. She spoke to strangers, to admirers, to companions of the airwaves. Her voice, once carried by cinema, now traveled only through wires. And yet, in those calls, she was free to be herself, unseen, unjudged by mirrors. Perhaps there was comfort in that anonymity, a freedom to exist without the weight of her face. The cracked mirror, however, still hung before her, an emblem of the paradox she could never escape. She was beauty, but beauty destroyed her. She was goddess, but goddesshood crushed her humanity. She was woman, but the world allowed her to be only myth. What, then, was she in the end? The mirror offers no answer. It reflects only fragments, leaving the question to us who look upon her story. The cruelty of time is something we all face, though rarely with the intensity Hedy endured. Perhaps this is why her struggle still haunts us. In her fractured reflection, we glimpse our own future, our own fear of fading, of being forgotten, of losing what once defined us. Her tragedy is not hers alone. It is a mirror to us all. The cracked glass shimmers faintly, catching a ray of weak light, then fading into shadow. And in that shadow, another sound rises. Not the gavel of a courtroom, not the applause of a theater, not even the whisper of a mirror, but the faint, distant ringing of a telephone. A ring unanswered, echoing into emptiness. From the fractured mirror of her beauty, we move now into her exile of solitude, into the quiet of rooms where only the telephone connected her to the world. The cracked glass shimmers faintly, catching a ray of weak light, then fading into shadow. And in that shadow, another sound rises, not the gavel of a courtroom, not the applause of a theater, not even the whisper of a mirror, but the faint, distant ringing of a telephone. A ring unanswered, echoing into emptiness. From the fractured mirror of her beauty, we step now into the long exile of her solitude, into the rooms where silence reigned and only the telephone carried her voice across the void. Hedy Lamarr, once the brightest star on screens across the world, retreated into herself in her later years. The glamour of Hollywood had long since receded. The applause had faded into memory, and the scandals had left their scars. She withdrew from public appearances, declining interviews, shunning the cameras that had once been her livelihood. Her world grew smaller, reduced to quiet rooms, drawn curtains, and the rhythm of days without witness. In Florida, in a modest house far from the palaces of Vienna and the studios of Hollywood, she lived as a recluse, a figure of legend hidden behind ordinary walls. It was the telephone that became her last stage. She would spend long hours on the line, speaking to strangers, admirers, acquaintances who reached out. Sometimes she called numbers at random, eager for a human voice on the other end. The conversations varied, some light, some bitter, some filled with memories that poured forth as if they could no longer be contained. Her voice, though aged, still carried a trace of the presence that had once held theaters spellbound. Those who spoke with her often sensed they were speaking to someone larger than life, even as she lived in obscurity. The telephone was her way of refusing total silence, of keeping a thread between herself and a world that had largely forgotten her. Loneliness pressed heavily upon her. The isolation of age is difficult for anyone, but for one who had lived by the adoration of millions, the absence of attention was almost unbearable. She had once been surrounded by lights, cameras, admirers, companions. Now she sat alone, the hours long, the rooms filled with shadows. The distance between her past and her present grew into a chasm. And yet, within this solitude, there was also a kind of defiance. She had chosen, in part, to retreat, to shield herself from the cruel gaze that mocked her aging face. If the world refused to see her as she was, she would not give it the chance. In silence, she reclaimed a measure of dignity. The solitude was not complete abandonment. Her children remained in her life, though the relationships were strained, marked by misunderstandings and the complexities of her past. There were visitors at times, admirers who sought her out, journalists who longed for glimpses of the myth. But these were rare, fragments of contact in a long tapestry of seclusion. More often, she was alone with her memories, replaying them in her mind like reels of film that flickered endlessly, sometimes joyful, sometimes bitter, always unresolved. What did she recall most in those quiet hours? Perhaps the streets of Vienna, the lessons of her father, the laughter of childhood before the weight of beauty pressed upon her. Perhaps the nights on the Atlantic, watching the stars as she sailed toward Hollywood, filled with hope for a new life. Perhaps the faces of men who had loved her, or claimed to love her, and the sorrow of knowing none had truly understood her. Perhaps the inventions that had never been recognized, the patents that lay unused, the ideas that had slipped into silence. Memory is rarely orderly. It arrives in fragments, in sudden waves, in whispers that disturb the stillness of night. For Hedy, memory must have been both companion and tormentor. And yet, even in her solitude, she did not surrender entirely to despair. There was resilience in her, a stubbornness that had carried her through every stage of her life. From scandal to captivity, from escape to fame, from invention to dismissal. That resilience remained, even in seclusion. She lived, and in living, she defied the silence. Each phone call was a refusal to vanish. Each day endured was another act of quiet resistance. To live unseen, yet to live nonetheless, was perhaps her final rebellion against a world that had never known how to see her fully. The image of her in these years is haunting. A woman who once embodied glamour, now walking slowly through quiet rooms, her steps soft on worn carpets, her face turned away from mirrors, her hands reaching for the telephone as if it were a lifeline. The air heavy with the scent of dust and old books, the blinds half drawn against the relentless Florida sun, the silence broken only by the occasional ring, the rise of her voice filling the emptiness. There is sadness here, but also a strange dignity. She lived on her own terms, even when those terms were solitude. Is it not curious how a life so filled with voices, with applause, with music, should end in such silence? And yet perhaps this is the fate of all who are lifted too high. The fall must always lead into shadows. The goddess becomes recluse. The star becomes solitary flame. But even a solitary flame gives light, however faint. And Hedy's light, though hidden, had not gone out. The ringing of the telephone grows faint now, echoing unanswered into the empty rooms. And from that echo rises another sound, not of silence, but of recognition. Far away, in another realm of technology, her invention is rediscovered, her name spoken once more, her brilliance acknowledged at last. From the exile of solitude, we step next into the belated recognition of her genius, when the world finally turned to honor her for the gift she had given long before. The ringing of the telephone grows faint now, echoing unanswered into the empty rooms. And from that echo rises another sound, not of silence, but of recognition, distant yet undeniable. Far away in laboratories and boardrooms, in the invisible currents of wireless signals, her invention stirred again. The sketches she and George Antheil had drawn decades earlier, once dismissed and forgotten, now reappeared as the world discovered its utility. Frequency hopping, once a curiosity filed away in obscurity, became essential to the new age of communication. The late 20th century was beginning to realize what she had already known, that signals could leap unseen, that privacy and security could be protected by rhythm and pattern, that the air itself could carry messages without fear of interruption. For Hedy, this recognition came late, too late to heal the wounds of dismissal, too late to erase the years of neglect. But it came nonetheless. In the 1990s, organizations began to honor her for her contribution. Awards arrived, citations were given, her name linked at last to the technologies that underpinned satellites, cellular phones, wireless communication. She was recognized as an inventor, a pioneer, a woman who had given the world a gift far greater than her films. And yet the irony was sharp, for she received these honors in seclusion, too frail to appear in person, too weary to stand before crowds. She listened by telephone, her voice carried once more through wires as others spoke her name in praise. The world had finally remembered her, but the woman herself remained hidden, her presence reduced to sound, her face absent. How must it have felt to hear accolades spoken decades too late, to hear words of admiration not for beauty, but for brilliance, when the years of need had already passed? Recognition delayed is a bittersweet gift. It affirms what one has always known, yet it reminds one of all the years lost to misunderstanding. Hedy accepted the honors, but they could not erase the bitterness of dismissal, the solitude of exile. They were validation, not restoration. The scars remained. And yet there is something hauntingly beautiful in this late recognition. The world that had mocked her, ignored her, confined her to masks of beauty, was forced at last to acknowledge her mind. History had shifted, and in its shifting, her truth emerged. She became, in those final years, a symbol not only of beauty but of brilliance hidden, of genius overlooked. She stood for every woman dismissed, every mind underestimated, every soul judged by surface alone. Her story became larger than herself, a mirror for the blindness of societies that cannot see beyond appearances. The irony deepens when we realize that nearly every person today carries in their pocket a fragment of her legacy, Mobile phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all trace their ancestry back to her invention. Each time a signal leaps unseen, each time voices travel through invisible airwaves, Hedy Lamarr is present, though unacknowledged. The goddess of Hollywood became, in truth, the architect of the modern world. She gave us connection, even as she herself lived in disconnection. She gave us voices across distance, even as her own voice echoed unanswered through telephone wires. Late recognition cannot erase solitude, but it can alter memory. In those final years, she knew she had not been entirely forgotten. She knew her contribution had value, her mind had mattered. That knowledge, however small, was a light against the shadows of decline. She did not live to see the full flowering of her invention, but she lived to know it had been vindicated. In that, there is a measure of grace. Still, the paradox remained. She had been celebrated too much for one gift, beauty, and too little for another, genius. The balance was never achieved. Even in recognition, the shadow of her myth clung to her. Articles praised her invention but still led with her title as the most beautiful. Even in correction, the world repeated its blindness. She was known but not holy, admired but not understood, honored but still enclosed in paradox. Yet perhaps this was her fate, her story woven not to resolve but to remain unresolved. Hedy Lamarr lived as contradiction incarnate, and so she was remembered. Her beauty dazzled, her mind defied, her life wandered between triumph and sorrow, between recognition and neglect. And in that wandering, she became timeless, her story echoing beyond her own years, inviting us to reflect on how we see, how we judge, how we remember. The static hum of a satellite fills the air now, distant, constant, carrying voices across oceans, carrying signals between earth and sky. It is in that hum that her spirit lingers, for it is her gift that makes such connection possible. And yet, as the satellites orbit high above, on Earth she remained alone, a woman of shadows, living out her final days in obscurity. The recognition had come, but it could not undo the solitude. It could only echo faintly, like applause heard from another room, muffled, too late. The hum of the satellite fades into the flicker of an old film reel spinning, its images blurred, its sound faint. For from recognition of her invention, we return again to her dual legacy, to the unresolved tension of her life. Was she the goddess of beauty or the mother of wireless communication? Was she both, or was she always something more than either? The reel spins on, the images blurring into each other, as we step next into reflection on the woman who invented the future while never escaping the past. The hum of the satellite fades into the flicker of an old film reel spinning, its images blurred, its sound faint. For from recognition of her invention, we return again to her dual legacy, to the unresolved tension of her life. Was she the goddess of beauty, or the mother of wireless communication? Was she both, or was she always something more than either? The reel turns, and with it the images of her life shift from one to the other. The luminous actress in gowns of shimmering silk, the solitary inventor bent over blueprints, the woman crowned with fame, the woman cloaked in silence. They overlap, blur, resist clarity. In the spinning of the reel, the contradiction becomes the truth. Hedy Lamarr was remembered most often by the world for her beauty. Even late in life, when awards were given for her inventions, articles still framed her achievements with photographs of her youth, as if brilliance could only be validated when wrapped in allure. Yet beauty was never her true self. It was the mask the world forced upon her, the prison that confined her. Her true self was restless, curious, inventive, filled with ideas that reached beyond glamour. To reduce her to beauty is to diminish her, yet to erase her beauty is to misunderstand her entirely. for it was beauty that gave her both entry into the world and exile from it. In her, beauty and brilliance were not separate, but entangled, each shaping the other, each both gift and curse. Without her beauty, she might never have reached Hollywood, never have been known to the world, never have had the platform to present her inventions. Without her brilliance, she would have been only another star, remembered briefly and then forgotten. Together, they made her extraordinary. Together, they made her incomprehensible to a world unable to hold such contradiction. She was always too much, too beautiful to be taken seriously, too intelligent to be reduced to a mere face. And so, she was never fully seen, never fully understood. The reel spins faster now, images blurring. A smile on screen dissolves into a hand sketching diagrams. A love scene fades into a courtroom. A red carpet blends into a silent room in Florida. Her life defies narrative simplicity, resists resolution. To speak of her as goddess is to ignore her genius. To speak of her as inventor is to erase the sorrow of her beauty. To speak of her as tragic is to miss her defiance. To speak of her as victorious is to overlook her pain. She was all of these, and yet more than all of them. Perhaps that is why her story lingers. It is not a tale of triumph alone, nor of failure alone, but of both woven together, inseparable. She embodies the paradox of human life, the gifts that destroy us, the burdens that elevate us, the contradictions that cannot be reconciled yet shape us entirely. We who look back at her life are left with questions more than answers. Was she victim or visionary, prisoner or rebel, forgotten or immortalized? The truth lies not in choosing one, but in accepting the impossibility of choosing. She was all of them and none of them. Her legacy, then, is not resolution, but reflection. She forces us to ask how we see others, how we reduce them to images, how we overlook what does not fit our categories. How many other minds have been ignored because they resided in bodies deemed too beautiful, too ordinary, too female, too something other than what the world expects? How many gifts have been delayed, dismissed, discarded because of the blindness of society? Hedy Lamarr is not only remembered for her inventions, but for the injustice of their dismissal, not only for her beauty, but for the weight it placed upon her. Her story becomes emblem, warning, mirror. And yet beyond emblem there remains the human being. We must not forget that she lived, breathed, laughed, wept, that she sought love, that she raised children, that she dreamed and feared and struggled as any of us do. To see her only a symbol is to commit again the error of reducing her. She was more than beauty, more than invention, more than tragedy, more than myth. She was a woman with secrets, contradictions, complexities beyond what history records. And perhaps this, more than anything, is her final truth, that she cannot be contained in a single image, a single story, a single title. The film reel slows, its images stuttering, the flicker of light dimming. In its final frames we see not resolution but blur, a face luminous yet shadowed, a hand reaching for a telephone, a page of diagrams half finished. No one image captures her. No one ending defines her. She remains unfinished, open, echoing. And in that unfinishedness lies her immortality. The reel clicks to a stop. The projector's whir dies away, leaving the room in silence. Out of that silence rises a soft wind, carrying with it the sound of dust moving gently across the floor. For as the reel ends, so too does her life draw near its close. And so we step next into the final curtain, into the moment when the goddess of the screen, the inventor of the future, the woman of paradox, departed this world and returned at last to the soil of Vienna where her story began. The reel clicks to a stop. The projector's whir dies away, leaving the room in silence. Out of that silence rises a soft wind, carrying with it the sound of dust moving gently across the floor. That wind stirs the curtains of a quiet Florida house where Hedy Lamarr lived her final years in seclusion, far from the lights that once adored her. She had withdrawn almost entirely from the gaze of the world, closing herself away as if the weight of years and memories were too heavy to bear in public. The goddess of cinema, the inventor of invisible signals, now spent her days in quiet obscurity, her presence known only to those who heard her voice over the telephone. It was a life reduced to stillness, yet within that stillness there remained the echo of all that had been. She died in January of the year 2000, at the age of 85. The new century had just begun, its wires and air already filled with the technologies she had helped to imagine, though few who carried phones or sent signals knew her name. Her passing was quiet, unmarked by the grandeur that had once surrounded her. No red carpet, no flood of cameras, no fanfare. Death, which comes to all, came to her as well, stripping away the myths, leaving only the woman, fragile, mortal, silent at last. And yet even in death her story did not end, for her ashes were returned across the ocean to Vienna, the city of her birth, completing a circle that had stretched across continents and decades. There is something deeply symbolic in that return. Vienna had been the place of her childhood, her first footsteps on cobblestones, her first lessons in beauty and curiosity. It was also the city she had fled, escaping the cage of her first marriage, escaping the shadows of rising fascism. To return there in ashes was to bring the story full circle, to restore her to the soil that had shaped her. Perhaps it was fitting that the city which had once judged her for scandal, which had watched her departure in silence, would now hold her remains in reverence. In returning, she reconciled with her beginning, even if the reconciliation came only in death. Her family carried out her wishes, scattering her ashes in the Vienna woods, where leaves whisper with the wind, where birdsong lingers in the morning air. There, in the quiet of nature, she found the peace denied her in life. No longer pursued, no longer judged, no longer adorned or dismissed, she became part of the earth, part of the cycle that knows no scandal, no fame, no invention, only continuity. The woman who had given the world beauty and brilliance dissolved into the soil of her homeland, her essence joining the silence from which she had once emerged. Yet even as her body returned to dust, her story continued to echo. Newspapers reported her death, some recalling her as Hollywood's great beauty, others acknowledging her as an inventor, long overlooked. Tributes came, some genuine, some perfunctory. There was no single narrative, for her life resisted simplicity even in memory. She was remembered in fragments, in contradictions, just as she had lived. For some, she would always be the star of Algiers, the face that captivated. For others, she would be the pioneer whose invention underpinned modern communication. For still others, she would remain a scandal, a recluse, a figure of mystery. No single remembrance could contain her, and so, her death, like her life, left questions unanswered. What was her true legacy? Was it beauty or invention? Was it the films that still flicker on late-night screens, or the signals that still leap unseen through the air? Was it her defiance, her restlessness, her refusal to accept confinement? Or was it the sorrow of being unseen, misunderstood, forgotten? Perhaps it was all of these woven together into a tapestry of contradictions. Her story defies resolution, and perhaps that is why it endures. The image of her ashes scattered in the Vienna woods lingers. The wind carries them through the trees, mingling them with leaves and soil. The same wind moves through the city streets where she once walked as a child, past cafes where ideas once filled the air, past theaters where she first dreamed of the stage. Vienna had changed, The world had changed, but in that moment the circle closed. She returned not as goddess, not as inventor, not as scandal, but as dust, as memory, as presence. And yet, as we reflect on her passing, we cannot escape the paradox of her life. She gave the world the future, but was denied her own place within it. She embodied beauty so radiant that it blinded those who gazed upon her. Yet behind that beauty, she carried a brilliance that went unrecognized for decades. She lived in the light and in the shadows, exalted and ignored, loved and abandoned. In the end, she was like the signals she invented, present yet invisible, carrying meaning yet often unnoticed, essential yet hidden. The soft wind in the Vienna woods grows quiet now, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves, the whisper of dust settling into soil. And from this quiet arises a final question, not of her life alone, but of memory itself. What remains of those we have admired, judged, misunderstood? Is it the image, the invention, the scandal, the silence? Or is it something deeper, something we cannot fully name, something that lingers beyond definition? With Hedy Lamarr, the question remains unanswered as her story resists conclusion. The wind continues, soft and steady, carrying her memory into the distance. And so we move into the final echo, into the meditation on her legacy, on the long echo of memory that asks us not who Hedy Lamarr was, but who she remains for us still. The wind continues, soft and steady, carrying her memory into the distance. It drifts beyond the Vienna woods, beyond the streets of her childhood, beyond the theaters where her first steps toward fame were taken. It moves outward, across continents and oceans, across towers and wires, through the air itself. For in that air lingers the gift she gave, a way for voices to travel invisibly, securely, endlessly. Each signal that leaps between frequencies is a fragment of her presence, a continuation of the mind that once sketched blueprints in solitude, and so the wind becomes more than wind. It becomes her echo, her memory, her persistence. We are left now to ask, what remains of Hedy Lamarr? Is it the luminous images on film, preserved in archives, flickering on screens when the reels are played again? Is it the invention that reshaped the world, the foundation of wireless technologies that bind us together today? Is it the scandals that once shocked, the shoplifting, the lawsuits, the surgeries? Or is it something less tangible, something that hovers between all these fragments, the sense of a woman who lived too large and too complex for any single truth to contain? History often seeks resolution, a single narrative to define a life. But Hedy defies resolution. She is remembered as both goddess and exile, as both beauty and mind, as both gift and tragedy. Each attempt to name her leaves something unsaid. Each story told leaves another untold. Perhaps this is why her memory haunts us still. For in her contradictions, we see not only her, but ourselves, the way we too are never one thing, never wholly known, never fully seen. There is a gentle lesson in her story, if lesson it may be called. It whispers to us about the danger of seeing only surfaces, of judging by appearances, of confining others to the images we prefer. Hedy was judged by her beauty, adored for it, confined by it, destroyed by it. Yet behind it burned a mind that could imagine futures. How many other lives have been diminished because we failed to look beyond the surface? How many voices silenced because we could not imagine that brilliance might dwell in forms we did not expect? To remember Hedy Lamarr rightly is to remember not only her, but also the blindness of those who failed to see her. And still, there is wonder, too, for even in dismissal, even in solitude, her light endured. Her invention survived, outlived her, reshaped the world. Her films endure, their images still luminous, still capable of captivating. Her story continues to be told, not only in books and documentaries, but in the very signals that connect us now. When you hold a phone to your ear, when your voice travels across air and wires, when messages leap invisibly from one point to another, Hedy is present. She is not only past, she is present, living still in the systems we take for granted. In that sense, she escaped the oblivion of neglect. She gave the world a future, even if she was never allowed to fully live in it. What, then, is her legacy? It is not one thing, but many. It is beauty, yes, but beauty shadowed by sorrow. It is invention, yes, but invention shadowed by neglect. It is triumph and tragedy, applause and silence, visibility and invisibility. Her legacy is paradox, unresolved and enduring. And perhaps that is the truest legacy any life can leave. Not a single answer, but a question that lingers, a mystery that endures. In the end, perhaps we should not ask whether she was more goddess or inventor, more beauty or mind. Perhaps we should simply remember her as human, restless, brilliant, flawed, courageous, wounded, enduring. To remember her as human is to honor her more fully than any crown of beauty or belated award could. The wind carries on, soft and steady. Somewhere, a film reel flickers, her face shimmering once more. Somewhere, a satellite hums, her invention alive in its circuits. Somewhere, a telephone rings, unanswered, echoing into silence. And somewhere, perhaps in your own hands, a signal leaps invisibly through the air, a fragment of her legacy touching your life without you even knowing. So let us end not with an answer, but with a gesture of remembrance. The next time you hear the static of a radio, the hum of a satellite, the invisible connection of a wireless signal, pause for a moment. In that sound, remember Hedy Lamarr, the beauty who invented the future, the woman who gave the world a gift it did not know how to receive, the restless soul who lived always in paradox. Remember her not as goddess, not as myth, but as a woman whose story continues to echo, timeless, unresolved, carried forever by the wind.